this kind of contemporary iconoclasm that we're in the middle of, right?
The person is the image, right? Like, I think that iconoclasm happens when people lose iconic vision, when they don't see the symbolic anymore, right? When they live in a flat, one-dimensional world, and then all of a sudden it only represents the one thing, right?
He says on page 292, now the Hermeticist is essentially an iconophile. And symbols are not obstacles that must be eliminated in order to arrive at knowledge of the truth, but rather means for receiving revelation.
Yeah, and that revelation might be painful, right? And then you have to contend with it, and that is what the thorns are.
There's good and there's evil in that image, but if you erase
iconic vision,
you don't see it.
Right. Exactly.
I see the iconoclastic movement is just a historical inevitability. I mean, of course it's happening. Yeah. There's no way it wasn't going to happen. You go through this period of blindness and the eyes open again and you can see what you've been looking at the whole time. Right. But to return to a place and to know it again for the first time.
I mean, an icon can become an idol, right?
Yes.
Yes.
And this is something that I think Tom Berg talks about from Revelation, how to make all things new, right? That's kind of the task of Christian Hermeticism, is to not get stuck. How do you not turn it into an idol?
That's the exciting part of the time, this turbulent time we live in, is that we can bring like major arcana or Christian iconography or, you know, anything in that realm of that symbolic order.
To me, the difference between an icon and an idol really has to do with the mode of attention. And if you're looking at something as opposed to looking through something, that's going to make it an idol instead of an icon. And we were radically enough suggesting that, like, because it is a mode of attention, that even something that is literally a pagan idol, if it is engaged with in the proper way, with the proper mode of attention, can actually function as an icon.
Also, there's something in the act of being the human in that iconographic sense that Christ teaches us.
I'm just going to lay this on my cards on the table. There's this hiddenness of God in the world, right? And I think it's hidden in plain sight. It's the image of a man. That is the hiddenness of God to me in the world. And George MacDonald talks about nature as being, the wardrobe with which we clothe our thoughts, right? That everything that happens inside of us is the world is man turned inside out, he says, so that we can do this mirror thing, right? We're reflecting on it and we're using the terminology from what we see, from the representations, as Barfield would say. We're using that to describe our inner life, right? And I know I'm walking on a really sharp edge, but we are made in the image of God. And so there's this reciprocity, right? And that's why I think images are so important. And that I think this is exactly what the magician is talking about, is that you make this journey into yourself, right? And that's what makes all the work play, because it opens the world up again, right? And then you can hold everything on your fingertips, because suddenly the world is iconic, right? And it's talking to you about you, but when it talks to you about you, it talks to you about God at the same time, because you are the image of God.
Right. And I think Sophia is the mirror.
Yeah, wait till you get to the High Priestess chapter. I'm interested to hear, Michael, how might you bring a sophiological perspective to bear on how does sophiology come to bear in this question that Sherry's asking?
That is sophiology.
That is sophiology. That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, that was a perfect expression of it. She nailed it.
I mean, that's what it is.
That is it. Because, and this is where, when he says it's the art of learning, this concentration without effort, this gazing, right? There's a progression there where you where you gaze and you contemplate and you walk and then you're at the mirror. Right?
Well, yeah, the thing is, there's theoretical sociology, which is okay, but there's practical sociology, and which is what this is, right? And the notion that divinity speaks to us through the things of this world, or like one of my favorite poems by Richard Wilbur, love calls us to the things of this world, right?
Yes.
And it's really what it is. That's the essence of it. And and I'm not too interested in a purely theoretical sociology. It doesn't mean anything if it's not practical, if it's not something that can be lived. George MacDonald is a great example of someone who illustrates how that actually works. Novalis is another, Henry Vaughn's another. I mean, certainly for poets.
Yeah.
And when you begin to see that, then you become, that is the revelation, that is we are God revealed in the world. When you can see God in the world, you can also image God forth into the world. When you see God in nature, or in your neighbor, or wherever it is that you're encountering God, when you are recognizing the Sophianic presence of God, you are also bringing that to bear. Yeah.
Which brings us back
in the enchanted world, and you are being transformed, and you don't even know it.
All of Thomas Traherne's poetry is about exactly this right here.
right.
Enter into the kingdom by a change of disposition, right? Becoming a child,
Yes.
right? You'll never enter the kingdom of heaven unless you become like a little child. And that's what George MacDonald was doing.
Yeah.
Right. Which brings us back to the idea of play earlier, which was part of the image of the magician, the turning work into play. That's connected with the child.
Even to reframe like some of like the more cerebral activity, like theology and biblical interpretation and all these kinds of things. Like Robert Capon, he says from the outset in that book, Kingdom, Judgment, Grace, that his whole approach to the text is this approach of playfulness. It's coming from this spirit of playfulness and a spirit of discovery versus like rational enclosure and possession. And
of course, the sage, to Harding, is the person who returns to that state of childlikeness. And I mean, this correlates perfectly to Barfield when he talks about original participation, withdrawal, and final participation, right? It's the same process. And that's also Sophia, right? Like that's moving into enchantment. It's all those things, I think.
And I think it's where we really struggle is to just, in a sense, to see the big picture, right? Nobody's stepping back and saying like, what is the big picture telling me about where we're at in reality right now and what our relationship to it is.
Right. One of the things that the magician is about is this union of conscious and unconscious, which relates to this whole idea of peripheral vision and our tendency toward this narrow focus, objective kind of vision within Western culture, which I think Ian McGilchrist rightly sees as endangering us in the long run, which brings us back to the ecological ramifications of sociology and all kinds of other things. So that's a really rich area of thought.
It's too many things for me to talk about.
Even the apocalyptic formulary of I looked and I saw, right? The apocalyptic act is to see what is in front of you. What is in front of you has become then an act of revelation where you can actually see. We're looking all the time, but we're not seeing.
And that's why the tarot is so important, because it's an image. And it teaches you to see, right? It's you can look at the image, but you have to learn. It's the art of learning to see, which is iconicity, right? Which is iconic vision, and which is why we live in a world of representations, right? Because to find God is to see God. This is what Job says, I have heard of you, but now I see you, right? Now I see you. And how did he see God? He saw God when God said, look at this, you don't get it. That's how he saw God.
Right.
God opened up the whole thing to him and said, you're never going to understand this, Job, right? But he saw all the images.
He talks about how it contains all of the arcana itself.
He calls it the arcanum of the arcana.
You know, with that symbol of eternity.
Well,
and
he calls it at one point. He said at one point he calls the magician the representation of the spirit man. Ultimately, from a Christian perspective, that's the man who's united to Christ. which is why I said that we earlier in the conversation that we need to connect love to this, because it's the kind of knowing that we're talking about is really love.
Mm-hmm.
I.e., to transform the scientific method into pure analogy based on pure experience. That's it. And without that fundamental unity, then the technique of analogy doesn't work at all.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the more thorny areas of this
Yeah.
chapter for
Yeah.
sure. I think
Yeah.
we could talk about that for several more hours.